Okay, one final lecture here for this week's work. We're going to discuss Aristotle, Book 1, Chapter 2. Hopefully you have that in front of you so that you can follow along with me. It's obvious from reading these two chapters of Aristotle's Rhetoric that Aristotle is trying to define rhetoric in a way that will answer Socrates. Aristotle takes a two-pronged approach to this. First, in Chapter 1, he shows it to be the counterpart, rhetoric to be the counterpart of dialectic and something that all men use. Then in the second chapter, he offers a definition that will not fall prey to Socrates the way that Gorgias did. Let's examine Aristotle's definition of rhetoric. All right, Gorgias defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion in courts of law and other assemblies. Aristotle said, no. That's not the art of persuasion. It is the faculty, he said. The faculty, the ability to observe in any given case the available means of persuasion. Socrates' objection was that rhetoric is imitation of true art, a form of flattery, the ignorant persuading the ignorant. Aristotle escapes that charge. It's not the ignorant persuading the ignorant. It's not flattery. It's not manipulation, sophistry. No. All men use rhetoric, and what they do is they look at the case. They look at the situation. They look at their audience, who they're trying to persuade. They look at the available arguments, the arguments available to themselves, and from that they make a case that they believe will be the strongest case and give them the best chance of persuading. It is also interesting to note that not only does Aristotle claim that all men use rhetoric, but he also now claims that it applies to every subject, which, by the way, it does. Rhetoric is not limited to justice. It's not limited to courts of law and other assemblies. All men use it. We use it for all sorts of things. I would imagine that some of you students will use some rhetoric later on today, or someone will use it on you. Pay attention. Notice when people do. Now, there are some questions about whether Aristotle's definition of rhetoric is adequate. Really, there are two objections that we can make to Aristotle's definition. And the first one is this. He says that rhetoric is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Okay? So, you've observed in a given case the available means of persuasion. Have you used rhetoric yet? See, you can achieve that without using rhetoric at all. Okay, so that's the first thing that we need to be concerned about. And really, the first problem with Aristotle's definition is that if you're simply observing the available means of persuasion, you are not using rhetoric. The second problem with Aristotle's definition is that there are available means of persuasion that would not qualify as rhetoric. For example, a gun to the head, a baseball bat can be very persuasive, all right? But that's not rhetoric. So understand those two things. Number one, the fact that you've observed the available means of persuasion does not mean you've used rhetoric. And number two, the fact that you found some means of persuasion doesn't mean that they are rhetoric, all right? Your book, The Rhetoric Companion, will point out later on that a cute girl winking can be very persuasive, and many guys find it persuasive. However, that is not rhetoric. It does not qualify as rhetoric, nor should we count it as rhetoric as well. So Aristotle, really, in answering Socrates' objections, overcorrected. His definition really applies to invention, which is the first of the 5 canons of rhetoric. We'll discuss those later on. But discovering available means of persuasion really is the first step in composing a piece of discourse. Now, Aristotle identifies 3 artistic modes of persuasion. I want you to notice what they are, We talked about them in the last lecture. They are ethos, pathos, logos, and some smart aleck one time identified a fourth means of persuasion, which he called bogos, the bogus argument. Let's discuss these three modes of persuasion. First, each mode of persuasion depends on something different. Ethos depends on the speaker's character, the speaker himself and his character. Pathos depends on the passions or emotions of the audience, putting the audience in the right frame of mind. Logos depends on the argumentation of the speech itself, the actual arguments that are being used. So, persuasion is achieved using these three modes of persuasion. Through ethos, you persuade when your audience believes you to be credible, trustworthy on the subject. Through pathos, you persuade an audience when you put the audience in the right frame of mind, when they believe that you're right and feel they need to do something about it, when they're motivated. Through logos, the truth or apparent truth of the proposition is demonstrated. And again, referring back to chapter 1, Aristotle said that the most powerful persuasion is achieved when you've proven or demonstrated your argument. So this is how persuasion is achieved. Related to these modes of persuasion, then, there are some things that are necessary for a man to be in charge of, in command of, with each mode of persuasion. All right? The man must be able to reason logically. There's logos. The man must be able to understand human character and goodness in their various forms. That's ethos, the ethical proof. And a man must understand the emotions. That's pathos or passion. Aristotle then takes some more time to discuss logos. I should say it the same way every time. I'm sorry I don't. Logos he refers to as persuasion achieved by proof or apparent proof. That's logos. Here again he relates rhetoric to dialectic. Notice, he points out the two methods of proof, which are enthymeme and example, but he also shows what their counterparts would be in dialectic. In dialectic, it would be induction. In rhetoric, it is example. Okay, so induction is the dialectic counterpart of the example in rhetoric. In fact, he calls example a rhetorical induction. Syllogism is dialectic, and enthymeme is rhetoric. Refers to rhetoric. In fact, he calls the enthymeme a rhetorical syllogism. Now, here's how Aristotle defines induction in dialectic and example in rhetoric. He says, when we base the proof of a proposition on a number of similar cases. Okay? Now, that's the idea of induction. An inductive argument works exactly the opposite way of a deductive argument. The way I explain it to my logic students is this. Deductive arguments are valid or invalid. Okay? Let's see. Well, let's use our syllogism from earlier, since I'm not thinking well on my feet anyway. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now that's a valid argument. Okay? Deductive arguments are measured as valid or invalid. Inductive arguments are measured as strong or weak. Here's an example of an inductive argument. First, the temperature dropped and the sky was cloudy and gray the last 2 Mondays, and it snowed. The sky is cloudy and gray and the temperature dropped again today. I think it might snow. Now, that argument is not measured by whether it's valid or invalid. The argument is measured by whether it is strong or weak. If I say, okay, I'm looking at the sky, the temperature's dropped, the sky is gray and cloudy, it's cold outside, I think it's going to snow. All right? That's what it did the last 2 weeks. I think it's going to snow again. That's a strong argument. Okay, here's a second example. The last 3 times I had a fever and a sore throat, I had strep throat. I have a sore throat right now, and I just checked my temperature. I have a fever. I must have strep throat again. All right, again, that would be a strong argument. Aristotle defined example. He defined syllogism and enthymeme this way. When it's shown that certain propositions being true, a further and quite distinct proposition must also be true in consequence, whether invariably or usually. This is called syllogism in dialectic, enthymeme in rhetoric. Essentially, this is the definition of validity, what he's saying. A simpler definition of validity than the definition he gives would be this. If your premises are true, your conclusion must also be true, because your conclusion must follow from the premises. He said speeches that rely on examples are as persuasive as the other kind, but those which rely on enthymemes excite the louder applause. Because we feel it's been demonstrated, that's why. Aristotle continues by pointing out what makes a statement persuasive and credible. He's still dealing here with logos. 2 reasons, 2 things that make statements persuasive and credible. It is either directly self-evident. For instance, he is a father, so he is a man. That's directly self-evident. That figure has 4 equal sides and 4 square corners. It must be a square. All right? It's directly self-evident. Or else it appears to be proved from other statements that are directly self-evident. Here's an example of that. If he has a 2-liter of pop, he must have gone to the store. He has a 2-liter, so he must have gone to the store. All right? Here's another example, maybe a better one. If he's sick, he must have a fever. Joe's sick all day, so he must have a fever. Now, notice that in that case, the conclusion appears to be proved from other statements that seem to be self-evident. However, there is a problem with this, and the problem is in the first premise. If he's sick, he must have a fever. It actually should be the other way. If he has a fever, then he must be sick. Joe's had a fever all day, so he must be sick. All right? Related to this, Aristotle explains the difference between probabilities and signs, which Aristotle refers to as the material of enthymemes. Notice how he describes them. A probability, he says, is a thing that usually happens, but only if it belongs to the class of the contingent or variable. So, for example, when it's cloudy, it sometimes rains, or if I punch you in the nose, your nose will bleed. Usually. Not always. I have had my nose punched before, and it did not bleed. I won't explain that to you. All right. In logic, we have what we call the square of opposition. All right. And on the square of opposition, we take the 4 different kinds of statements: the universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. We put those up on a square, and we show the relationship between those statements. Really, every declarative statement falls into one of those 4 kinds of statements. Okay? Rather than say universal affirmative, universal negative, let me explain it to you this way. You have the all S is P statement. That's a universal affirmative statement. So all men are humans. Okay? Then the universal negative. No S is P. No people are dogs. All right? Then you have the particular affirmative. Some dogs are beagles. Okay, and then you have the particular negative. Some dogs are not cats. All right? Some dogs are poodles does not mean that all dogs are poodles. there's a relationship between those two statements. It is true that some squares are rectangles, and also it's true that all squares are rectangles, but it's not universally true. It's not true every time. So the relation between that some are and all are is not consistently true. Sometimes when the particular is true, the universal is also true. But many times the particular will be true, but the universal won't be true. For example, some dogs are beagles, all dogs are beagles. The particular is true, some dogs are beagles. But the universal is not true, all dogs are beagles. Okay? The truth of the particular does not in any way imply or even require the truth of the universal. That's what Aristotle means when he says that a probability bears the same relation to that in respect of which it is probable as the universal bears to the particular. I'm positive when you read that the first time, you had to read it again if you were trying to think about what you were reading. When you heard me read it, you probably scratched your head and said, I still don't get it. But that's essentially what Aristotle is saying. He's saying that the fact that the particular statement is true does not necessitate the truth of the universal statement. Signs are divided into two kinds, fallible and infallible. Aristotle says that signs do both. The relation that the universal bears to the particular and the relation that the particular bears to the universal. So, some signs are probabilities. Do you think those would be the fallible signs or the infallible signs? Well, if you said it is a fallible sign, you're correct. Probabilities are fallible signs. The infallible sign is a complete proof, irrefutable. Aristotle uses this example. The fact that he has a fever is a sign that he is sick. That's a complete proof. That's irrefutable. That is an infallible sign. Okay? We can give plenty of other examples of it. The fact that he is a father is a sign that he is a man. Okay? Because fathers are always men. There never has been a father in the world who was not also a man. All right? A fallible sign, which is refutable, would work the other way. Okay? The fact that he is sick is a sign that he has a fever. Well, maybe. I'm pretty sure that most of you have been sick before but did not have a fever. So, I'll give you a chance. Just think it through. See if you can come up with some fallible signs, some infallible signs of your own. Okay? Another infallible sign. The fact that it is a square is a sign that it is a rectangle. The fact that it is that it is a triangle is a sign that it has three sides. Boy, we could come up with plenty more. And I'm not thinking well on my feet here. Here's a fallible sign. Let's switch gears to that. The fact that it is cloudy means that it will rain. Well, maybe, sometimes not. The fact that it is raining means that it is cloudy. That's much more likely. But you've also seen it rain before when the sun was shining, right? It wasn't cloudy at all. Those are fallible signs. Infallible sign. Let's see. The fact that he has cancer is a sign that he's sick. That's an infallible sign. Okay. You can ask questions about that if you have more. Aristotle concludes chapter 2 with a discussion of general and special lines of argument, which is a subject he'll not revisit until much later, near the end of chapter 2. I'm sorry, not chapter 2, book 2. He doesn't revisit that until the end of book 2. For right now, we'll simply rehearse his definitions. By special lines of argument, I mean the propositions peculiar to each several class of things, by general, those common to all classes alike. Aristotle's point is that there are those lines of argument that are unique to a specific subject or course of study. Like, for instance, perpendicular and parallel lines in geometry, or the letter of the law and the spirit of the law in ethics. Those are special lines of argument. There are also lines of argument that can be used for any argument, regardless of the subject matter. Okay? Those are general lines of argument. The a fortiori argument. If it's true of the lesser, then it's true of the greater. You've used it before. If she can get married, then anybody can get married. If that guy can find a girlfriend, then there's hope for you. That's a general line of argument. It's the a fortiori kind of argument. Okay, there's the big language, all the technical terms and technicalities. Chapter 2 especially has a lot of things that if you're not familiar with, you can get discouraged very quickly. That's why I wanted to put it together in this lecture for you.